I'm Roz Walker and I am a professor at the Nunkira Institute for Change, director of an amazing Coolamon Research Centre, and also worked for a very, very long time with Pat Dudgeon and at the School of Indigenous Studies and Transforming Indigenous Health and Wellbeing. Yeah.
What's your relationship to the Working Together book?
Okay, so my relationship with the Working Together book is like, at one level, a proud mother. You know, with Pat and Helen, I was one of the co-editors for the book, and my responsibility was to kind of lead the organisation and the bringing together of all of the authors and the whole kind of publication side of it under the guidance and leadership of both Pat and Helen. And so we worked very much as colleagues and collaborators throughout the entire period of time, which seemed at the time to be maybe 3 gestation periods. It was quite a while, yeah.
What were the circumstances like when you co-edited the book? So was it challenging, difficult? Are there any anecdotes you could share about that?
When we did the second edition of the Working Together book, we had already completed the first edition, and that had a phenomenal amount of challenges in terms of really interrupting the existing discourse, if you like, and challenging some of the disciplines, particularly psychology and social work and what have you. When we got to the second book, it was already evident that the feedback from the first book was very complimentary. It was evident that it was required, that there was this thirst, if you like, to have a book that actually supported all people who were working in the area of mental health and social emotional wellbeing, but also services that worked with people who were affected by mental health and wellbeing. So by that second edition, the whole idea of what it was there for had broadened. So we were invited, if you like, by government to pick up that challenge and do it. And we had to obviously put in a tender and everything. But nevertheless, we had already then, by that stage, been given a lot of respect for what it was that we'd been able to do with the first book. I think one of the big challenges was that we were still working against disciplines that were quite confronted by the fact that we were wanting to take an Indigenous perspective on all of the disciplines: social work, education, obviously health, and psychology and psychiatry. So we, in that sense, there were a number of challenges selecting the right people to be involved in the book, and then having them as our allies, like discipline allies in the book. Whoops.
That's all.
I think the other big challenge was that we were really committed to having Aboriginal authors as leaders in the Working Together book. We wanted to have an Aboriginal perspective on all elements of all topics and all aspects of mental health and wellbeing. So it meant really making sure that we had the right processes, that we had a really great governance structure, that we had Aboriginal experts who provided that leadership to determine how we were going to plan this book and take it forward. So with the first edition, you know, it's about this big, and the second edition is about this big, and it's very heavy. And the reason it extended so much was precisely because we had such input from Aboriginal leaders all the way through. So that was very exciting to have that. A challenge was then finding people who were in a position to sort of support the writing of the book. So having lead Indigenous authors, because at that stage, I can't remember the exact figure, but Pat had talked about, I think there were only, say, 36 psychologists or something that were, maybe a few more, but that's not a lot of people who are then going to be able to spend that time being part of the writing of a book. They're all in high demand and what have you. And things have since shifted. I mean, there's a major uptake of all of those disciplines now. But that certainly provided a bit of a challenge. But we have a great network of people, and both Helen and Pat were able to rally the troops and all of the various different associations that they're involved in. And then part of my role was to ensure that for each of the chapters that we provided the right level of support to ensure that people had the time and the focus to be able to complete those chapters. So yeah, it was an amazing responsibility, great privilege, but also really multitasking, and my brain kind of having to spread across a phenomenal amount of different topics and areas at one time as we worked with each of the different Aboriginal areas of specialisation. Yeah.
The second edition was published in 2014. What was the discourse around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander mental health and wellbeing at the time?
I would say at the time it was still very much a deficit discourse, still very much, and in that deficit discourse, often comparing everything about Aboriginal mental health and wellbeing to non-Aboriginal mental health and wellbeing, and kind of trying to show how it was 10 times worse or 6 times worse, but not always with an understanding of the context in which that the reasons might be for the existing mental health and wellbeing issues. And the other thing about it was kind of making it all about the person rather than any responsibility for the context and the colonial context in which Aboriginal people have been surviving for the last 250 years, prior to which they had survived, 60,000 years and plus, in a way where they had been able to be very holistic in their sense of health and well-being. So that understanding of that holistic notion of health and connectedness to culture, country, kin, spirituality was not in the discourse in 2014 still, even though people like Beverly Swan and Raphael had, and Pat Raphael had done an incredible amount of work back in the late 80s and 90s to really push people's thinking about what Aboriginal mental health and wellbeing was. The mainstream disciplines had still very much held on to the idea that if there were issues for Aboriginal people, they sat within their choices. And so we pushed that and really found the evidence, developed the context, really, Pat's chapter 1 is really an understanding of the social and political and cultural context in which Aboriginal people found themselves, and how that has had an incredible impact on their health and wellbeing. So that was a huge pushback against that existing discourse of the time, with an evidence base and with authority. And much of that authority came from both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal discipline experts. So it was profound in that sense. Yeah.
And then how do you think the discourse has changed in the intervening 10 years?
Yeah, so I think now the broader society is far more understanding of the role of culture and country and family for Aboriginal people, and a far greater understanding of the impact of colonisation. And that the very fact that there are now welcome to country, acknowledgement to country, that often now have much more than just a few words, but really deeply link into how, with stories about how those connections are really critical to Aboriginal health and wellbeing, suggests to me that there's been a really widespread change and acceptance and acknowledgement of the importance of recognising culture in Aboriginal social and emotional wellbeing.
How do you place the Working Together book in the wider context of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander mental health and wellbeing in Australia?
Sounds a bit, yeah, sounds a bit like we're, blowing our own trumpet or something, but I know from feedback that we get that it's considered a seminal text, that it has been a groundbreaker, and that it's led the way for many other people to pick up elements that in the disciplines and work with that and explore areas. So I think it's actually become a springboard, for continuing the thinking and dialogue around Aboriginal mental health and social emotional wellbeing. Standards, the sort of workforce standards, all of those things have shifted, and I believe a lot of those things have shifted because books such as the Working Together book and the subsequent information and resources have been able to really help push those standards and understandings. Yeah.
So for the chapters that you co-authored, what what topics and themes did you write about, and who did you work with on those chapters?
So a few chapters actually, but one chapter in particular which was really exciting to work on was a chapter on interdisciplinary care, and I worked with Aboriginal colleagues, and Dawn Bezarab, who's here, and Clinton Schultz, Rhonda Marriott, many others, and we talked about the fact that if we're discussing the idea that Aboriginal mental health and social emotional wellbeing is holistic in nature, then you need to have a multi-interdisciplinary team of people to support and address those various aspects, and that team needs to know how to work together, communicate together, and be able to support someone. So it was really exploratory and drew on people's lived experience, people's expertise, Dawn Bezarab's incredible expertise in social work, Clinton's work in psychology, and Rhonda's work with perinatal mental health and wellbeing, really bringing together a whole range of different understandings, and we had a couple of doctors as well. So that was a really exciting chapter to say, well, okay, so what does this look like? So we were actually building a model of a framework and a model of practice, and over the years to see that book, that chapter used and cited and been helpful to people, that's been really satisfying. And then another chapter that was really interesting to do was the transforming policy and practice through changing cultural competence. And that was tricky because there's a whole sort of argument that says, well, cultural competence is just a tick box, so we don't want that in for Aboriginal people. It's not about aspiring to cultural competence. But we took the frame, again, working with Chris Son and Clinton Schultz, we took the perspective that cultural competence, as with clinical competence, is about ongoing learning and the lifelong journey. And so, again, with that chapter, we really kind of worked it until we really got down to the nuts and bolts of power, like white power, and the fact that non-Aboriginal people have to really give away that power. Their competence comes from their willingness to be critically self-reflective and really listening again to Aboriginal people. Yeah. So they were a couple of my favourites. Yeah.
I guess beyond the ones you've already touched on, are there any other ideas from the book that you'd like to talk about more that either were very pioneering at the time or now, still now, or are even, are particularly relevant today or even more relevant today?
The social and emotional wellbeing, chapter 4, social emotional wellbeing framework, that was really, the framework was already there. It had already been talked about of what makes Aboriginal social emotional wellbeing, but articulating it and depicting it and having a way of showing that framework in a way that made sense to people and what each of the elements of the framework meant was something that I believe was really important and has provided a platform going forward to all of the work that's being done in the area of Aboriginal social emotional wellbeing, and it's informed policy frameworks and practice frameworks. Both national and state policy frameworks. So that's a sort of really powerful outcome, and I believe that the book gave the impetus for that to be really articulated. It could have, that same group of psychologists, Aboriginal psychologists, could have got together and had that conversation, and indeed did in various different ways, but to get it into a book that was then so widely disseminated and downloaded and everything meant that it really got its place in the sun, and so that's been really profound. And then there's other things like there's a whole area of the book that looks at programs. So these are Aboriginal programs that have been developed by Aboriginal people, sometimes in their own journey to find their own social and emotional wellbeing, and then they've worked with them and developed those programs and then talked about them in the book. And many of those programs have, again, really become very consolidated and well used due to getting, again, that sort of widespread dissemination and exposure. Yeah. So in addition to the programs, I think one other area that has been quite profound is in mental health assessment. So we had a chapter in the book that discussed the idea that existing mental health assessments were culturally inappropriate. They, again, because they worked from that deficit discourse that we talked about at the beginning, it did not take into account the notions of culture and the connectedness to country or trauma, the understanding of the colonial impacts. Many assessment tools and processes have been completely inadequate, and in doing so been problematic for Aboriginal people in the appropriate treatment, in the appropriate ways to be supported. So I was part of that chapter. It was led by an Aboriginal psychologist, Yolanda Adams, and And I think that was a really important chapter because, again, we started to push that idea that this needs to be done differently, and gave examples of assessments that were appropriate, if you like. But what has become apparent over the years is that it's often used as a springboard by Aboriginal psychologists now to be the basis for some of the papers and processes they've used in developing Aboriginal mental health assessments going forward. And now whereas that was quite challenging at the time, it's now commonplace, and it's actually accepted that there really needs to be different ways of doing assessment. And I think that's, again, formed a really good basis for practice.
What do you think the impact of the Working Together book has been?
Well, impacts with heart, isn't it? Well, I think the fact that it's used by so many universities, with GPs, with psychologists, even with educators, I think its impact has been to help change the thinking around Aboriginal health and social emotional wellbeing. But more than that, the history, like the understandings of different ways of viewing the world. The book is so much more than just a recipe of different things. It actually brings to life Aboriginal experiences, and I think its impact has been to enhance understandings. And we've had students write to us. We've had academics write to us and say that they believe that it's changed their students in really powerful ways and been transformative as how we wanted it to be. And I think that might perhaps play out in some of the shifts that you see in universities, where there's really broad recognition of the importance of Aboriginal knowledges, of giving voice to Aboriginal knowledges and Aboriginal ways of knowing, being and doing.
You mentioned the book being translated. Maybe you could talk about that.
Yeah, so that's right. I forgot about that one. Yes, we got a request from, I think it was Pearson. They were doing a international mental health handbook, which then goes globally. And they contacted us and asked if they could have excerpts out of various different chapters to bring into this handbook, which was then in turn translated into 11 languages. And that was incredibly, it was really powerful to think that it was having an impact for other countries. And I think we often say, if you get things right for Aboriginal people, if you get the process right and you get the commitment right, then you've got it right for everyone. So we used to think, well, 11 languages, they're not all Aboriginal peoples, First Nations peoples, and some of them would be vulnerable people, but just getting that shift and getting that preparedness to think differently, that felt pretty special as well.
Yeah, so then finally, if you have any thoughts on what you think the next steps are, or if you have any messages for the cohort coming up, I suppose.
I think the book continues to be used, especially with students going through. When I said before about universities, we had high schools as well contacting us. So their year 11, 12s were using elements out of the book. So chapter 1 was one of them, and the social emotional wellbeing. So when you're talking about cohorts of people coming through, having the book being used as a way of providing historical understanding is very powerful. And I think next steps going forward is to for whoever the next people who take up the legacy in writing is to continue to use the book as a platform on which to continue their thinking and perhaps providing the evidence that goes with. We put up a lot of ideas, a lot of suggestions for practice, and being able to have people use the book and provide the evidence that using that way of working in those with that commitment to change really makes a difference is something I'd like to see as a springboard into the future.
But is there, if there's anything else you want to talk about or say?
No, I think the fact that it's 10 years on, and this week alone I've had 2 requests for the book. It's ongoing, and we had these requests. Telethon Kids, contacted to say they've had another order. So, it's still being used, it's still relevant, and I think 10 years down the track, it's that's a good thing, that it's still got that relevance. And I love the idea that, we've talked about of maybe getting resources that really sort of fill the gaps, and maybe others updating the stats and everything. But I think it'll sit and stand as, an important seminal piece of work. Yeah.